Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman.
Here on Heroic Media, we explore news headlines that deal with very foundational moral issues relating to family, marriage, and life.
Exactly, and those issues tend to revolve around abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly. So what's our first story, Michelle?
Thanks, Patrick. First for today. In unscripted remarks during his recent trip to the U.S., Pope Francis said the most beautiful thing that God made was the family.
Nice. I like the off-the-cuff remarks because it gives you kind of that personal touch with the Pope. And so I think that it was nice that he said that about the family, what he said, that it was the most beautiful thing that God created. And I think it was very appropriate, being that he was just leaving the World Meeting of Families here in the U.S., had a long flight back home, and had some time to answer a bunch of questions from reporters, and that was one of the things that he had said. So
right, yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, the context of this is important, that the World Meeting of Families, this is the Pope's first trip to the U.S., and I think it's very important that he's coming in this context of family. The World Meeting of Families is an event held every couple of years in a different location around the world, and people come globally for it. So there were almost 1 million people, they believe, at the final Mass.
Wow.
That were just there to celebrate the family and to support and encourage the family. So this statement off the cuff, the most beautiful thing that God did, the Bible says, was the family. That was really beautiful.
Yeah, and it's great, having that many people there to celebrate the family. I was unfortunately not able to go, but I know a lot of people that did go, and they all had a great time. And I think that it's really important, especially at this day and age, when there's so many different things that are, the devil is attacking the family from so many different angles and so many different ways. So it was nice to have the Pope come here and reaffirm so many things about the family and kind of reiterate, I guess, the importance of the family.
Right,
I think it's
absolutely.
super duper important.
Yeah, and I actually had the opportunity to be in Philadelphia for this event, so I was there at this address. This particular address was at the vigil the night before the big Mass.
Cool.
But it was just so neat to see everyone there celebrating family. And the other thing that I really loved about it was the Pope gave some practical advice, which I thought was kind of just kind of fun, just kind of down to earth. He was talking about marriage, and he said, "Oh, sometimes plates fly, sometimes children bring headaches. Sometimes you get into fights." And then he said, "But the hope of the resurrection is what conquers everything. Love is the only way that we can overcome all of these things."
Yes.
So I just like the practical, yes, this is hard. This isn't easy. Being part of a family, the commitment of marriage, that's not an easy thing. But we're still called to do it, and we can do it through Christ and through his love and his resurrection.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm glad you pointed that out, because that was one of the big things that I got out of that too, because it's not like this whole thing was meant to paint a rosy picture of families are perfect and everything's easy and all this stuff, but families are this great beautiful thing from God, and they are work, and there are challenges that you must overcome, and that's all part of growing in love, right? It's all part of our fallen nature, and I think it's hard for people nowadays who everything is about being easy, right? Like you want to make everything in your life as easy as possible, from driving your car. Everything has to be perfect and smooth and easy, and your food has to be fast and quick and easy, and everything has to be super easy, right? Like the easy button, I don't remember, Staples or whatever, right? Everything has to everything is geared towards being easy and comfortable. And so I think in society we have such this attitude of trying to avoid things that are hard, that I thought it was very important for him to acknowledge that, because I know some people have problems with religious folks who just kind of try to paint this rosy picture, but acknowledging that there are difficulties, and that growing through the family in love is really what it's all about. Right.
And these particular comments, when he went off the cuff and set aside his prepared remarks, he was giving this address in response to 6 different families who came and gave their testimony from around the world. And there were some really, it was not sugar-coated. You had, an engaged couple that was talking about their kind of fears going into marriage. You had, a mother whose husband had abandoned her and she had a child with disabilities. You had people whose lives were torn apart by war. Really challenging circumstances. It was very honest.
Yeah.
And so I thought I really appreciated that too, just that honesty. And I think this is important because we are now moving into the Synod. The Synod on the Families, this 3-week gathering in Rome. And there's been a lot of talk. There's been efforts by some people in the church to try to tear down the family and tear down marriage, and let's change the rules on this and that within marriage. And we know that the Holy Spirit guides the church, so we can be confident that church teaching isn't just going to change out of nowhere.
Yes.
But I also thought that Pope Francis, during his interview on the flight, you mentioned he did an interview on the flight returning from this event, and I thought this was such a powerful statement. Marriage is indissoluble when it is a sacrament. And this the church cannot change. It's doctrine. It's an indissoluble sacrament. So I think that just gives us some hope and some reassurance going into this synod. We understand that our Holy Father is being guided by the Holy Spirit, that our church is being guided by the Holy Spirit.
Absolutely. And I think, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it was that's one of the things that I got out of Pope Francis's visit here with the World Meeting of Families. And I think a lot of other people got out of it as well, is just the reassurance, just like you said. As we already know, faithful Catholics know that the Pope doesn't have the authority to change objective truths, the truth about love, about the relationships between men and women, marriage, and the family, and he just reaffirmed everything. That is really what I got out of it, and so I think it was nice, because sometimes you hear dissenters and other people saying, oh, the church is about to change all this teaching and everything, and I thought it was very nice that he came here, reaffirmed all these things, showed by his actions and by his words, what love is all about, especially as it relates to the family, and then it's very, it's very timely, just like you said, because the synod here in October is coming up, and so I think it was a nice lead-in to that, I think.
Right, absolutely.
So, all right, let's move on to our next story. Planned Parenthood had harsh words for Pope Francis after he championed life, including before birth, in his recent address to Congress. So I think this is one of the things that kind of came out of this whole synod, right, is this reaffirming of Catholic teaching on things. There's kind of been some statements that are taken out of context. And so people get the idea that, Catholic teaching has changed and everything. And one of the things that happened when Pope Francis came is that he reaffirmed Catholic teaching in, I felt like, very concrete ways. Some of what Planned Parenthood was referencing was not even really a direct, he said, they acted like he said abortion, blah, 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 this, that, and the other or whatever. But he was really somewhat vague about what he was talking about, but it was obvious that he was talking about abortion. And of course, Planned Parenthood went up in a big tivvy about what he had to say and had harsh words for him. And so, I guess, what were your thoughts?
I thought it was interesting because you see people reacting in different ways. Some people are going, oh my gosh, the Pope didn't talk about abortion. He didn't mention these things.
Exactly.
And then you have Planned Parenthood going, oh my gosh, why is he condemning abortion? So what did he actually say? Let's take a look at what he actually said to see what he was talking about.
Right.
Just a couple examples. In his address to the U.S. bishops, this is one of his first big addresses when he got to the country, he listed off a list of tragic situations like wars, starvation, drug trafficking, terrorism.
Yep.
And the very first thing on this list was the innocent victim of abortion. He was decrying the innocent victim of abortion, how horrible abortion is. So that was, the first big thing. When he talked to Congress, he said, the Golden Rule also reminds us of our responsibility to protect and defend human life at every stage of its development.
Exactly.
That's very pro-life language.
Exactly.
When he spoke to the United Nations, he talked about respect for the sacredness of every life, of every human life, of every man and every woman, the poor, the elderly, children, the infirm, the unborn.
Yep.
So we see him reference this over and over again.
Yes.
He likes to do it in the context of other things. He likes to also talk about the elderly, about poverty. He likes to talk about all these issues together because he sees them as united. But you see him mentioning over and over again abortion and the unborn.
Yeah, and I think what stood out to me too, one of the quotes, he said, I cannot hide my concern for the family, which is threatened perhaps as never before from within and without. And so he did. He wasn't super in your face about it. Like you said, it was most of it was very just pro-life language, but it was definitely clearly offensive or whatever to Planned Parenthood, whose business is making money off of abortions, essentially, right? They make most of their money off of abortions. So yeah, I think there was a lot that kind of struck a nerve with Planned Parenthood. I think one of the things, too, that Pope Francis recently did that probably also struck a nerve was him kind of opening the gates a little bit more, I guess, giving more authority to local bishops to be able, and priests, to be able to forgive the sin of abortion, right? He called abortion sin, right? And so people hate it when you call what they do for a living or how they make their money a sin, right? People hate it even if they don't necessarily believe in sin. I think it strikes a chord with people.
Absolutely.
And so there were a number of things that he said, and so I think that it was beautiful too, because that type of, hey, we're opening, listen, there is no sin that is unforgivable, and opening the door to say, hey, come, be forgiven of your sin. If you come to a priest with a contrite heart, then you will be forgiven of your sin. I think that talking about abortion and those very grave sins, and opening the door and showing mercy is really causing, I think it strikes a chord, basically.
Right, absolutely. And I think if you look at the Planned Parenthood response to that, they kind of freaked out because they were lamenting, oh my gosh, this progressive Pope is like, why is he not actually progressive? And that's a mistake. Anytime that we liberal the Pope as conservative or liberal, we're not fully understanding him. He's Catholic. And so he's not gonna fall neatly into any kind of political party or category.
Right.
But what Planned Parenthood says, a board member of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, says his pursuit to stifle contraception access reduces women to basic purveyors of biological materials. That's so ironic. I mean, it would almost be funny if it weren't so sad.
I know.
What is it that's actually reducing women to basic purveyors of biological materials? Contraception and abortion. What is it that's reducing a woman to a body part that's turning sex into, this physical thing, but withholding the fertility and withholding the whole person? That to me was just such an ironic statement.
Yeah,
that really just shows you how twisted and how off the mindset is.
I totally agree. It's super ironic. And then also, I couldn't get over the fact that they were saying too, these spokespeople were saying that it's limiting women's access, by what he's saying. And I'm like, it's not. He didn't change a law or anything. The teaching of the church is, the church's focus is to save souls, and they do that, by teaching people what they should do and what they should not do, right? They don't say you can't do this, you can't do that. They say, listen, if you want to get to heaven, if you want to love God and show respect for your humanity and towards others, these are the things you should and shouldn't do. So they kind of try to put the Pope and the Catholic Church in a box that says they're these people that are nasty, that don't have respect for people and take people's rights away and want to do this, that, and the other. But it's just simply, obviously not true.
Right, absolutely. Coming up after the break, we'll talk more about the Pope's historic trip to the U.S., as well as in vitro fertilization.
Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. In our next story, you may not have seen it in the mainstream media, but Pope Francis's trip to the U.S. included several statements and gestures in support of religious freedom.
Great. So people are obviously happy that while he was here, he wasn't just preaching to everybody and saying a bunch of stuff, but also he was living out his faith.
Right, and we know with Pope Francis, he's all about the gestures. From the day one of his office, you have to pay attention to the little things that he does because, as we mentioned before, he's not into really direct controversial statements all the time. He does a lot through his actions, so you have to pay attention to that.
Exactly, and that's what he did here. He both spoke, of course, about what, things that were important, but he also lived those things out. He did a number of things, right? He went to prison and visited people. He went and visited the Little Sisters of the Poor.
Right.
He was visited from everybody from the president all the way to children in Harlem. And he just went and saw a bunch of different people, visited with people, prayed, spoke, lived out his faith, right? Like when he visited the Little Sisters of the Poor, he didn't say, we need to fight for our religion, make some big speech or anything, but by his actions, obviously he was in support of the Little Sisters of the Poor and religious freedom.
Right, and that's a big one because, of course, the HHS mandate, the Little Sisters are fighting that mandate in court, and so that visit, which was not scheduled originally, that was important. And he had one other unscheduled meeting that was important with Kim Davis, the clerk, who was in jail for 5 days and who's fighting this big religious freedom battle over gay marriage because she wouldn't issue the gay marriage licenses. So he met with her also unscheduled. So those two meetings were definitely big statements by Pope Francis.
Yep, absolutely. And so I think it was really good for people to see that, right? Of course, they're going to notice certain people like Kim Davis that he's going to visit, or the Little Sisters of the Poor, and make a bigger deal about it. But his actions, your actions should speak louder than your words, and his do. And so he continued that, right? I think while he was here. And there was, of course, a special tone. Part of his visit was meant to I think meant to kind of foster religious liberty and religious freedom, right? Saying that it is our right, especially conscience rights, right? And so when he was back on the airplane, flying back home, I loved this. Somebody was interviewing him from ABC, and they said, would that include government officials as well in regards to conscience rights? And Pope Francis says, it is a human right, and if a government official is a human person, he has that right. it is a human right. So I just thought that was kind of funny comment, because he said these are human rights, and then basically the reporter's like, well, even if you're a government official, and he's like, well, are they a person?
Are they a person? Right. And I thought,
So,
when they asked him the original question about religious freedom, and his response, he responded with a whole paragraph, but he said over and over within that paragraph several times, I think I counted about 7 times, he said that it's a right. He's like, this is a human right, over and over and over again. And he said, I can't have in mind all cases that exist about conscientious objection, but yes, I can say conscientious objection is a right, and that is a part of every human right. It is a right. And if a person does not allow others to be a conscientious objector, he denies a right. And then he goes on, but he keeps saying this is a right. He made it very clear.
Yes.
Some of this is more direct language. And so I think that, that speaks a lot, and it's sparked quite a debate afterwards. And after it was revealed that he had met with Kim Davis, there was a whole big discussion about this. And I think it's really going to have some impact in the way that the nation's dialogue moves forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was also very important that he spoke about the bishops too, and his support for them. He said that he supported really the efforts of the U.S. bishops and their efforts to defend religious freedom. So everybody from a county clerk to the bishops and everybody in between, he was very supportive, both in word and deed. And so I thought that one thing that we should point out too, he said, I'm going to quote him. He said, at the end of the day, what will defend religious liberty the best is evangelization. If people are really practicing their faith, professing it, worshiping it, but also putting it in practice by serving others and by supporting the ministries of the church that serve the poor, the needy, and the vulnerable, and our schools, all of which the Pope has also praised in these days, right?
Right.
So I think he really talked about living it out, right? And he was like, yes, you need to live it out, and then he was showing how to live that out. So I thought it was very good all around.
Absolutely.
All right, in our next story, egg freezing has been touted as a top way to expand future childbearing years. But a recent report shows that there's a decrease in success with frozen eggs. So a decrease in the pregnancy likelihood if you're using a fresh egg as opposed to a frozen egg. And so there's really not a ton of, I guess, research, reports and things like that done on the difference between a frozen egg or a fresh egg. But there's various reasons that somebody would go with and of course this is all in relation to IVF, right? So nowadays it seems like a lot of women are waiting later in childbearing years to become pregnant, or they're having trouble finding a significant other that they want to have children with. And so what they do is they resort to harvesting eggs and then having those eggs frozen in hopes that later they'll find the right person or whatever, and that they will then have an alternate to extend their childbearing years or place it exactly when they want, right?
Right, and it's interesting. The thing that I thought was really interesting that probably a lot of people don't realize is that even with the fresh egg, your chances of success with any given round of IVF is about 50%. So you have a 1 in 2 chance of it not working, and IVF tends to cost between $15,000 and $30,000.
Yes.
So this is very expensive, and you only have about a 1 in 2 chance with a fresh egg, and so when you freeze the eggs, that drops.
About
and
20%,
so it's really, I don't think people realize those numbers. And anytime that we talk about this, I think it's important just to have a sense of compassion, because people have good intentions. They want to have a child, so they're using IVF, they're using these artificial technologies. But a lot of people don't know church teaching, which is simply that we can't play God. We can't be taking our eggs out and freezing them and then joining them with sperm in a petri dish and artificial insemination. We can't do any of those things. There's all these different things that we can't do because that's interfering with God's realm. That's not ours to do.
You take procreation outside of the marital act is what you do, and put it in a petri dish, right? Which is not what God had intended. He wants 2 human beings to join together to create another human being. It's not part of his plan, basically. And you're right, it's like playing God. And it is really expensive, and that's also one of the reasons why, I guess, despite the, roughly 20% less likelihood of having a pregnancy when you already have a 50% chance as it is, which isn't super good, obviously, frozen eggs are cheaper. So there's like some timing and scheduling and things like that go into, harvesting fresh eggs from people, or getting the right donors, and depending on all the scenarios, right? We were not really going to go into all the different scenarios, but it's basically half, $15,000 to $17,000 for a frozen egg, but $25,000 to $30,000 for a fresh egg. So people tend to, because it's so expensive and because the success rate isn't very high, they tend to go for those, of course, more economical, options. So there's just so much to talk about here. Of course, we already mentioned IVF taking it outside of the marital act. It's not God's plan. But then also sometimes they'll say it's actually better if you freeze an embryo, which is a fertilized egg, which is a human being, because there's more cells associated with that embryo. And so a lot of times when they thaw out a frozen egg, there's just one cell as an egg, and so that cell dies. But if there's a cluster of 6 or 8 cells, because it's a human person, it's an embryo forming there, then if 2 die, they're pluripotent, they can continue to grow in a human being. So there's a lot of different things, moral implications that this has. So
I think it's also just worth noting really quickly that NAPRO technology, which is sort of tied to the Creighton method of NFP, that actually offers better success rates at helping people achieve pregnancy when they're struggling, and it is much more cost efficient, very affordable, and it's moral. It's in alignment with the teaching of the church. So that's something to check out if you or someone that you know is struggling with infertility. There are moral options out there.
Absolutely. All right, stay tuned. We have one more story coming up after the break.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story, Pope Francis's visit to a Philadelphia prison has some asking the question, how do we deal with those in our prisons?
Good question. I think, you know, one of the things we can see right off the bat, right, is Pope Francis going and visiting these people, right? He went there and he did preach to them. And I think it's good for I can only imagine being in jail, kind of just feeling separated from the outside world. Who knows how long you're in there, depending on your situation, but it's just got to feel awful. And so, you know, Christ told us that we need to go visit the imprisoned. And so he lives that out. And he goes there, visits them, preaches the gospel to them, and then wash their feet too, right? And so, I mean, I think it's just wonderful, the things, that living his example out and preaching the gospel, I think are 2 things that we can do for sinners in prison. And of course we need to do our best to help people not get in there in the first place, right?
Right, yeah. I think there's a sort of a 2-pronged approach here. Pope Francis shows us the encounter, as he always does, with those in prison. So he's looking them in the eye, he's talking to them. It's not enough just to throw food or money or Bibles at them. There has to be a personal encounter. And then the other half is not for people who are in prisons, but before they get there, what can we do as a society? What are we doing on mental health issues? What are we doing, I mean, for people who are growing up in broken families, in poverty, in violence, in abuse, with, you know, drug issues? What are we doing to help keep them out of prison? And then, of course, when people enter back into society, what are we doing to help them come back? Because if they can't get a job, and they might fall back into crime or drug use or other things. So the U.S. bishops have been calling for prison reform for many years. America actually contains 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's imprisoned population. So wild. It's a big issue. It's a complex social issue, but it's something that we need to look into and explore on multiple different levels.
Absolutely, and those statistics are just mind-blowing, right? Because you do hear, I hear from a lot of people, you know, it's like, gosh, our prisons are just so full. There's so much going on with the prisons. And so, yeah, and I think it's interesting that you know, this came up in the context of the World Meeting of Families too, because I think a lot of that prison time, or people going to prison, violating laws, you know, can be tied back to familial problems, right? The breakdown of the family. And so I think it just kind of reinforces the need for that family unit to be solid and to show love towards one another, so that you can avoid those scenarios to begin with. I think it's really appropriate too. You know, he always talks about, you know, or I guess with Pope Francis, you always think about him, you know, smelling like the sheep, right? And so I think this is a great example of that, right? He goes there, he's with them, he's you know, smiling at these women that were coming out and that he was about to preach to, and I just loved his openness, you know, that he was just like, listen, even though you're in here and the choices that you've made have brought you here, whatever the case may be, you know, God has laid this table out and you are all invited to join. So it's very welcoming. And very, you know, kind of had that familial.
Right, absolutely. And I think this is an issue that, you know, it's worth educating ourselves more about it. And Pope Francis has visited prisons multiple times. I think he's calling us, hey, pay attention to this. I didn't realize this, but there was an article in The Atlantic saying the prison that Pope Francis went to, 80% of the people there have not been convicted of the crime that they're there for.
Oh my
They're
gosh.
waiting for their trials.
Wow.
80%. And it said that the average wait time is somewhere between 6 months to more than 2 years.
Oh,
so
boy.
I think this is an issue there's a lot there to learn about, a lot to explore, a lot to be done. I think Pope Francis is calling us to give a little bit more attention to it.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's it for this week. Until next time, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.